On today's episode, we are joined by a podcast host who interviews experts in the field of quantum computing. Let's dive in. What is going on, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Quantum Resistant Ledger channel, your video portal into the world of post-quantum digital asset security. With me for today's episode is my co-host, Michael Strike, our Director of Outreach here at the QRL, and both of us are excited to be joined by Ethan Hansen, who is called in via audio. He is the creator and the host of Quantum Computing Now, a podcast that is right up our alley. It's great to have you with us, Ethan.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Cool. Well, we are excited to, just chat with you about a number of different things today based on, some of the conversations that you've had with experts in the field, kind of get your stance on a few different things. But I'd love to start out with what do you know about the QRL project and, what do you like most about it based on what you know?
Yeah, so I guess I don't know too much. Honestly, my big thing is quantum computing, not necessarily quantum cryptography. But what I do know is that it is essentially where Bitcoin is based off of blockchain. Bitcoin can be used for cryptocurrency and then also things for digital assets in general, signing things. Quantum resistant ledger sort of takes that, generalizes it, uses new, or maybe not new, but different technology than Bitcoin does to make it so that when we get to the point where quantum computers are powerful enough to do things like run Shor's algorithm and Grover's algorithm and actually potentially influence how we do cryptography, quantum resistant ledger sort of can step up and be resistant. Maybe not perfectly able to counter all attacks, but at least more resistant to quantum attacks than other classical blockchains like Bitcoin or Ethereum.
Yeah, that's a really good initial, description. So a couple things, for if anyone that's watching that's not familiar with our project. To what Ethan said, we're a purpose-built blockchain. That's purpose-built for to be quantum computer resistant, from the first block. So from Genesis, we have been provably quantum resistant. This is all based around XMSS and a hash-based signature scheme using one-time signatures around the XMSS protocol, which is recently NIST recommended. So to part of what you were saying, Ethan. So all of this is the project essentially looks like a Merkle tree, and you end up with these public-private key pairs, which are all hashes of each other. And because hashes are in many ways considered to be quantum secure. That's foundationally how the addressing structure works, as opposed to Bitcoin, which uses asymmetric public-private key encryption, which is based on elliptical curve cryptography, which, as you already know, is is built around factorization of prime numbers, which is what Shor's algorithm could potentially compromised by a quantum computer. So just a couple of links to fill in. But it's a good description.
Yeah, what I want to do now is I'd love to dive in, Ethan, to kind of your lane and your podcast a little bit. And how did you initially get involved in the space of, I'm sure you get this a lot, maybe from family or friends or just from other people that you interact with when they say, you do a podcast that's all about quantum computing, news, basic concepts and stuff. I read your piece that I think it was from 2017 or so, where you talk about kind of what initially got you interested in it. But what's the origin story which led to quantum computing now?
Yeah, so I guess the origin story of what led to quantum computing now is a little bit different than what initially got me into quantum computing, because I've been interested in quantum computing for a long time, but it sort of sparked my interest, and then sort of died down, and then I really started getting back interested, more interested into it. Summer 2 years ago, so I guess be summer of 2019, had an internship at IBM, who is one of the big players in quantum computing. And I actually got to, as part of that internship, have some 20% time to do my own thing, look for interesting things in IBM. And one of those things that I found was quantum computing. I knew a little bit about it, but I wanted to know more. So I got to actually talk to some experts, almost like a proto version of what I do on my podcast now. And I got to talk to some people who are working on hardware, some people who are working on software, just ask all my dumb questions and get them answered. And I went, that was pretty fun. And I've loved podcasts since forever too. So I looked for a quantum computing podcast. There was Meet the Mechanics, which is excellent. It's a little bit more technical, I would say. And I was a little bit sad because I looked and their last episode had been published 6 months ago. So I thought it was maybe not active anymore. So I figured, well, what the heck, I'll make my own and see how it goes. And yeah, that kicked it off, and it's been downhill since there.
Yeah. Can you dive into one part I thought was kind of cool was I think you kind of coined it of the quantum Dunning-Kruger effect. What's your kind of take on that? I saw that in your first piece. I think people that are viewing this might find that interesting. Can you touch on this just for a second, just in case, just for context?
Yeah. So it's essentially the standard Dunning-Kruger effect, where you start off and you go, well, I know that I know nothing, and then you start learning a little bit more, and you think that all there is to know about quantum computing. You think, well, quantum computing is going to solve everything. It's going to completely revolutionize every aspect of every part of our lives. We're going to have a quantum laptop some part in the future. And then you learn a bit more and you realize, oh man, there is so much more I don't know than what I do know. And you realize that there are a lot of smart people who are working on this, and even they don't know everything about this. And they don't have all of the answers of how we're going to make quantum computers, perfect in the future. And you realize, well, maybe I got to tone down my expectations a little bit. And then you maybe overcompensate. And then towards the end, you realize, well, yeah, quantum computers are probably going to change a lot of things, but maybe not all of the things. So yeah, it's sort of that roller coaster of how much do I know? What am I expecting from quantum computing, going from 0 to a lot to too much, too little to just about right.
It's almost a humbling experience to start with nothing, do all the research, become as educated on the topic as you can, and then end up with more questions than you had when you started.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the rabbit hole that you kind of almost wish you didn't go down because you went initially looking for answers and you end up with more questions. At least that's how it ended up for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an important part just to bring up in general with whether we're talking quantum computing or we're talking blockchain or anywhere in crypto, really. There's a lot of people that are overconfident and that haven't asked a lot of questions, haven't done a ton of research. And then a lot of people that have looked into it more are a bit more humble and grounded in that there's a lot that's still to be learned, and the industry is changing so fast. So I just wanted to bring that part up. As soon as I saw quantum Dunning-Kruger effect kind of as your example, I was like, oh, that's perfect to dive into. So appreciate you diving into that for a second.
Yeah.
One of the questions I want to dive into next is your podcast has a lot of thought leaders, experts, people that are involved in quantum computing. And what I want to ask you is whether you have someone on that's talking about dilution refrigerators or another area. You have a lot of guests that are really deep in depth in their specific lanes. What trends or maybe commonalities have you found across different guests that you've had on the show? Have you realized that, there's a lot of things that kind of are, in line or, all over the place? We can kind of go in a few different directions based on this question, but since you've had so many guests that are in a very niche field, I'd love to hear what your take is on having those guests talk to you.
Yeah, totally. So the first thing to note is that it's a super humbling experience, like Mike was saying, just hearing all of these people that know so much about their field, and you realize how little you know, and getting to ask them, dumb questions like I do, is just, it's fantastic. And I think that one of the trends or the commonalities we see across all of the different people who have come on the podcast, and like you were mentioning, it's software people and hardware people, business leaders, even some sort of quantum adjacent quantum cryptography people have come on the show. And what you realize is that it's really early for all of these technologies, but it's starting to pick up. Sometimes it feels like, and this isn't necessarily something that someone on the podcast has said, but at least for me, it sort of feels like we're the monkeys at the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey. We're hitting this quantum computer. Well, what if I hit it this way? Will it do something? What if I hit it this way? And it's sort of a lot of guess and check. Obviously, it's a educated guess and check, but it's still really, really early. And these technologies are maturing, and that's a second trend that I've noticed, is that it's speeding up. The pace of innovation is definitely accelerating. But that being said, it's sort of like, accelerating from 0.1 per year to 0.2 or 0.3 per year with arbitrary units. And yeah, so super early, and it's not necessarily, like I said, quantum computing isn't here. There are quantum computers, but if someone tells you that we are currently in the age of quantum computing, I would disagree and say that if this is the age of quantum computing, then the 1960s to mid 70s is the age of the personal computer. It's still too early to call it the age of quantum computing, but you can see that trend where we're definitely getting towards the age of quantum computing. You see that, like I said, in software, where the pace is really accelerating in that we're anticipating this hardware to continue growing. And so we're creating softwares are more available, bigger, more error corrected. And as that continues, that sort of pushes from in front this hardware innovation where, okay, we've got these algorithms that can do really cool things if we can get it to 100 qubits with this level of error correction. And so you make sure you get those 100 qubits with that level of error correction. Hardware, even on things like cryogenics, dilution refrigerators, is you wouldn't think that there's much progress you can make on things like refrigerators, but there definitely is. And you see this continuing over time. You see better dilution refrigerators that can use less power, get things colder. And that's really important for superconducting qubits if we want to scale those to reach that 100 qubits and make these really good quantum computers that can actually solve really useful problems.
So I'm thinking a lot of ideas come to mind on some of the things you said. On the last one, probably getting a dilution refrigerator, it's not something you can walk into Sears, right? And there's certainly varying degrees of, no pun intended, of quality of dilution refrigerators. The best ones that I've seen are fractions of a degree above, can bring temperature down to fractions of a degree above absolute zero. And I don't remember which hardware company, which quantum computer manufacturer that it was. I think it was IBM that was saying they're developing their own. They're also becoming almost a refrigeration company because what they're trying to do, some of this stuff doesn't exist. Which is really interesting to me because thermodynamics and refrigeration and phase change, was invented in Carrier 1901. That technology has been around for 120 years, and we're still finding ways to make things colder. But one other topic I want to touch on, you were talking about the history and correlations of the past with quantum computers. Now, I'm going to share my screen for just a development. Okay, can you guys see this?
Yep.
So looking at this today, don't look at just without paying attention to the outside of the yellow boxes. Such instruments, it was said, could revolutionize modern engineering, bring in a new epoch of industrial design, and eventually eliminate much slow and costly trial and error development work. Heretofore, I don't think I've ever even said that before, sheer mathematical difficulties have often forced designers to accept inferior solutions of their problems with higher costs and slower progress. Its inventors say it computes a mathematical problem 1,000 times faster than has ever been done before. Nothing inside its 18,000 vacuum tubes and several miles of wiring. I'm not saying that history directly repeats, but this article kind of reminds me of this old, like it rhymes. History does rhyme. If if a qubit were a vacuum tube, and the things that they're saying. So this is the ENIAC. No, it says this. It says that down here, and when it was a vacuum tube based computer. It was the size of a building. I read a book on it like 20 years ago. I think I remember the lights would dim in the city when they turn it on. And if I'm not mistaken, that's actually where the software bug came in. There was an insect that had crawled into the vacuum tubes and shorted it out.
Yeah.
But to what you're saying, you were correlating the past with the present. So yeah, we are at an early kind of a bit of an infant stage. But here's the difference between then and now. If we're working on an ENIAC, we're working on vacuum tubes. We're doing state-of-the-art technology in the 1940s. If we want to collaborate, we have to make telephone calls, right? Or we're writing letters, we're making phone calls, we're trying to gather people together. The degree of collaboration that we have now is 10, 15, 25-fold, right? We've got Zoom meetings, we've got email, we can take PDFs, we can take white papers, light papers, audio file, anything, and just send it across the world in a matter of seconds. So taking into consideration the degree of communication and the efficiency of that, I can see that speeding along the progress of quantum computers much more quickly. I think it was Hartmut Neven that said that he was experiencing the growth as doubly exponential. So I thought this was interesting based on what you were saying. So.
Strike, what I want to segue into now is I want to come back to what we were discussing with some parts of quantum computing, but I'd like to segue in just for a few minutes on to blockchain, so we could ask Ethan kind of what his take is with the quantum threat related to obviously Bitcoin, Ethereum. You want to dive into that for a few, Strike? I know you had a question or two regarding this.
Yeah. So Ethan, you're from my understanding, you're a bit of a blockchain enthusiast.
Yeah,
a little bit.
Sure.
Okay. What projects are you familiar with besides the QRL?
I'm a little bit familiar with sort of the big names, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Monero. I've heard a little bit about Dash and a little bit about Nano, and then one that I used to be like a big fan of was IOTA.
Yep, all big name projects. So you're most likely aware that all of these projects, besides QRL, are based on asymmetric cryptography, as are 99.9% of blockchain and crypto projects in general, which are all susceptible to factorization and shores. So someone that doesn't work on as a potential holder of quanta, how do you feel? Like, what's your take on this? What's your take on this quantum threat to blockchain? I mean, Ryan and I have been talking about this for quite a bit of time, but I'd love to hear an outsider's view that has not just blockchain knowledge, crypto knowledge, and quantum mechanics knowledge. So, like, where do you quantify this risk at, this post-quantum threat?
Yeah, that's so. I think there's two parts to this, and I'll do what I do with my podcast, and I'll lean on people who know more than I do. Um, but so I recently read a interesting article that was published. I don't remember all of the authors, but one of them that stood out because I had heard his name before was Peter Rode, um, and it was on quantum crypto economics. Uh, which and in that they talk about sort of two ways that quantum computing will influence how we use cryptocurrency and cryptography. And the first one was what they called Grover expansion, and the second one was a Shor attack. So Grover's algorithm, for people who aren't as familiar with quantum computing, is a way of finding a certain element in a list of elements. So if you have an unordered list, typically you've got to search through all of them, right? You go, is this the number one? No. Is this the number one? No. You go all the way to the end. Finally, you find the number one. Um, and that takes however many elements you have there. Grover's algorithm can do it in square root time. So it's what we call a quadratic speedup. And a lot of people say that quadratic speedup isn't really enough to get useful speedup out of a quantum computer. But that's a potential attack vector from quantum computing on the actual hashing for mining new blockchain. So what they're talking about there with the Grover expansion is that you're sort of expanding the supply by mining it like way faster than it should be. And then the second one is like what you were talking about was the Shor attack. And that is looking at the factorization, looking at these private public key pairs, and attacking them directly with Shor's algorithm, which gets a much faster speed up than Grover's exponential. And they, in that paper, didn't really give too much of a timeline on when these would come into play. But there was another paper that was a survey of a bunch of different experts in quantum computing, asking them one of the questions that I think is probably most relevant is what's the time frame they think that a quantum computer will be able to factor a 2048-bit number. And they said that about the consensus was 50% of them said it would be 15 years or more. And so I think that that's probably about right. I think we're looking at about a 15-year timeline to get quantum computers to the point where either of these attacks are somewhat feasible, either Grover expansion or direct Shor attack. I might bring that down a little bit closer to, say, 10 years, looking at how aggressive quantum computing companies like IBM and Google have made their roadmaps. IBM is planning on having 1,000 qubits by 2023. So 10 years out is, they can continue that pace, they'll be up to about 30 to 50,000 qubits, I think, which might not be enough to attack what we currently use on blockchain like Bitcoin, but we'll be getting close enough to be significantly scary by 10 years, and then probably definitely scary by 15.
So that's I mean, I agree with you on several things. The hashing attack vector is given the power of the aggregate amount of ASICs that exist in the world today that are all doing that are doing terahashes and terahashes of processing against proof of work consensus. The consensus with myself and a lot of people that I talk to definitely seems to lean much more on the elliptical curve side of things. I was reading a book, Blockchain and Business, the other day, and we were trying. The author was trying to summarize and break down the exact number of qubits, and with optimizations against Shor's, we've finally landed at the number. I think it was 2,300. That part's accurate, and I think it was 2,330. Now, granted, that's those are clean qubits, right? Probably perfect qubits, which we don't have today. There was also that paper on how to break ECC with 20 million noisy qubits, right? But as what you're asking is really the big question. What is the time frame here? Nobody can deny that progress has been made on all fronts, and the quality of the qubits, the manufacturing process. You were talking about dilution refrigeration in order to reduce systemic noise within the system to prevent premature decoherence, right? There's also there's algorithmic improvements. Shor's algorithm isn't the only algorithm that can be applied to for speed up in polynomial time. It's really difficult. It's really difficult to say. But one thing we do know for certainty is if you have data that needs to be secured 10 years from now or 15 years from now, to your point, it has to be post-quantum secure today. If you want that secured data to not be able to, that needs to be secure potentially for 20 years, let's say, government data or something like that. Post-quantum security needs to be implemented today. Blockchain is a different use case, obviously, but and I've said this before. In order to make Bitcoin post-quantum secure, would be an enormous distributed effort that would have to be coordinated and agreed with some sort of consensus on how to move forward. Yeah, collectively, and it would be an unprecedented amount of effort in the blockchain community. Not to that scale, in order to coordinate something that big, I would say that's probably never been done. So, I'm not saying it couldn't. Like I've said this before, I'll never underestimate the ingenuity and the creativity of blockchain and programmers in general. But that's where you really have to ask yourself, what is your risk? What is your comfort degree when it comes to risk?
Yeah, and I think what you were saying about making sure that your data is post-quantum secure today is interesting, especially when you look at blockchain, because there are already threat actors that are going in there scooping up data so that when they've got a quantum computer in the future, they can decrypt it. Well, they don't have to do that with blockchain because it's already doing it for them. That ledger is there permanently, and you can go and you can look at it at any point in the future and start attacking it. You don't have to take the extra step of scooping up the data because it's already out there in the public for you.
Yeah, the data is all there. There's a couple different Bitcoin addresses. You've got pay to public key, pay to public key, and also pay to public key hash. So in Bitcoin, you can actually pay to the hash, which gets written to the blockchain. But at the same time, in order to sign the transaction, your public key is still exposed to the node, and it sits in the mempool on the node. And who else knows where it goes? So not your node, not your rules. But in fact, that doesn't even pay to public key hash is when in the context of quantum computers. I'm not even really sure how relevant it is because there's public keys that exist that used an output of pay to public key, and those exist on the blockchain. If a bunch of really old, 1,000, 10,000, 15,000 Bitcoins just started moving around from different addresses, that would create confidence chaos. I'm not saying that would be the attack vector of a quantum computer. I think what they probably would do would be the attack vector would be strong enough to be able to make a sizable and substantial profit, but small enough to try and stay as statistically under the radar as possible. There'd be a balance there. I think that's how that would play out. But fact is, the public keys exist everywhere. So, yeah.
Yeah, what I want to do now, Ethan and Strike, is I want to dive into what I'm going to coin as QRL Quick Fire. So if you guys are good to do this, what I want to do is I'm going to ask you both in sequence. I'll go Strike first, then I'll ask Ethan, but I'm going to ask a couple questions just off the cuff, and I just want to see what your answer is. So don't dive into like a long, elaborated answer. Just give me whatever comes off the top of your head. So my first question is
Off the
going to
top
be,
of our head, just no thinking.
yes. Yeah, just a little bit of thinking, but okay. What is your favorite company making progress in the space? D-Wave, IBM, who's your favorite? Sorry.
Honeywell.
Ethan?
IonQ.
Besides our channel, QRL, and your podcast, of course, what is a favorite resource of yours online to stay up to date with latest news in the field?
Google.
Ethan?
There's another podcast called Non-Local. Check it out.
Okay, perfect. And last of the QRL quickfire questions, if you could have dinner with one, really well-known leader in the space, whether it be like Richard Feynman or a David Deutsch or, I don't know, Einstein, whoever it is in the past, who would you choose, Strike, as your dinner guest?
Man, I love Feynman so much, and Einstein's obviously genius, but man,
you got a wild card?
I'm going to go with Neil. I'm going to go with Niels Bohr. Just because. I mean, Einstein's undeniably genius. He was able to present enough argument against whether or not there were hidden properties within subatomic particles that were entangled with each other. Which goes back to the gloves in the box analogy. I think on his Bohr's tombstone, it says something like the guy who proved Einstein wrong, which, I don't think that's entirely true, but I would like to have lunch with that gentleman.
Cool. Ethan, who you picking as your QRL quickfire last question for your, who you going to have dinner with?
I'm going to go with the current one, John Preskill. He's not in the past, so he can call me anytime. Let's have dinner.
Awesome. John, if you're watching this out there, you know where to find Ethan. But as a closing question in today's QRL episode, what I want to do, Ethan, is I just want to ask you, where are you most excited about progress being made in the space right now, whether it be in the next year or two, or maybe it's 5 to 10 years out? What are you most excited about today overall?
Yeah, I'm most excited about this is a trend that I don't think I mentioned earlier, the democratization of quantum computing, in that I think this really started with IBM putting a quantum computer on the cloud, but now more and more companies are giving people more and more access to do really cool science with quantum computing. Real access to quantum computers is fundamental to understanding how they actually work. You can use a simulator all day long, but it's not going to give you exactly that error characterization that you need to do things like error correction and get fault-tolerant qubits. So yeah, that march of we have enough abundance of quantum computing resource, even though there's not a whole lot, there's enough of an abundance that we can give high school kids and college students who are looking to get started in quantum computing access at least a little bit, and they can play around with it, get used to it, and start making contributions further on down the line.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Well, Ethan, both Strike and I, we really appreciate you coming on to join us for today's episode. If you watching at home, if you enjoyed this kind of conversation, this discussion that we've had, make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you can be in the VIP club and be the first to know when we come out with new episodes. And we're all about post-quantum digital asset security here at the QRL. Ethan, I want to ask, just give us a plug real quick. Where can people find out about your podcast? Where's a good place for them to find that?
Yeah, so my podcast is on anchor.fm/quantum computing now, or you can find me on minds.com, MINDS, at one Ethan Hansen.
Perfect. And for those of you that are just used to the good old Google, the recommendation that Strike used earlier, just if you go to Google and just type in quantum computing now with podcast in the end of the query, you'll find his podcast. In closing, if you want to learn more about our project, go to the QRL.org, watch some of our other resource videos. And as always, we just want to bring you the latest in post-quantum digital asset security. And we're all about having the discussion in general overall. And we will see you all in the next episode. Keep those digital assets secure, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.